Can you touch on, I mean, how well do because what comes up often when you share the results of these kinds of observational studies, it's like, well, there's a lot of confounding variables to it. It's correlational. It's not necessarily causation. That, you know, somebody who lives closer to areas of high exposure might be lower on the socioeconomic spectrum. How well are researchers able to control for these myriad variables?
So let me first tell you a story, and then I'll come back to how do you go from an association to causation. So there was a really smart woman named Lillian Calderon Garcia Duenas, still living at the University of Montana. She was the Doogie Howser of Mexico. At age 16, a woman, young woman, goes to medical school in Mexico City, and she's concerned about the air quality in Mexico City, which had the worst air quality in the world in the early 1990s. So she does a crazy study. She looks at children and young adults who unfortunately die prematurely from either car accidents or gun violence in Mexico City. She looks at 203 brains, ages 11 months old, infant, to age 40. In 202 of the 203 brains, she finds the pathology of Alzheimer's disease.
Mm. Wow. And I mean, in children, all the way
in children. So this is before they're diagnosed. No one's got Alzheimer's disease, right? They're too young. You're 40 years old. You don't have Alzheimer's disease by and large. And so 11-month-old clearly doesn't have it. But they have the seeds of Alzheimer's disease there. 20% have the seeds of the misfolded alpha-synuclein in their brains, including in the lining of the nose, the olfactory epithelium. She then does a second study. She looks at dogs in Mexico City and dogs in a less polluted part of Mexico City, a less polluted part of Mexico. She finds that the brains of the dogs in Mexico City have high rates of Alzheimer's pathology versus the dogs in the less polluted one not having. So that's powerful evidence that the seeds of this disease begin early. In your documentary, Outstanding, you said 10 to 20 years. It might be 30, it might be 40, it might be 50 years. It might be generations before the disease manifests. For your mom, it might be what she was drinking, in summers in Long Island, manifesting 50 to 60 years later. So this question of how do you go from association to causation. So do you know how smoking was found to cause lung cancer?
No.
So there was a study, it was called the British Doctor Study, and it was done by a physician named Richard Dahl and a statistician named Sir Bradford Hill. And they did this crazy study in England, remarkably similar. They took postcards, they mailed them to doctors. They had the doctors fill out, do you smoke? Yes, no, and how much do you smoke? And they mailed the postcards back to Dr. Dahl and Dr. Hill. And they just waited for them to die. And then they compared the causes of death for those who smoked and didn't. And so they looked at those who smoked and looked for lung cancers and then non-lung cancer. Sure enough, people who smoked had a 30-fold increased likelihood of developing lung cancer. So Sir Bradford Hill said we have great association between smoking and lung cancer. But how do we know it's not something else? How do we know that's not smokers are also drinking more coffee, and therefore it's the coffee that it is, and the smoking is just a marker for it? So he was deeply troubled, and so he put together a lecture, and he put forth 9 criteria from which we could move from an association to a causation. Now, I'm not going to get all 9, but some of them were the strength of the association. So you have a 30-fold increased risk, you get better sit up. If you have a 150% risk, a 500% increased risk, 70% risk, 124% risk, you need to pay up. Is there a consistency of findings? Does this happen? Is it replicated in multiple studies? So it's not just one investigator who does it, but it's multiple distant investigators. Is it biologically plausible? Is it possible that smoking cigarette could lead to lung cancer? Sure. So other competing theories at the time were actually, was it asphalt? Was it sequelae of gases from World War I? Not the craziest ideas, sure, asphalt. But this seems things. Does exposure happen before the disease? And sometimes not even so clear, but clearly you smoked before you died, so that it happened that way. Are there animal or laboratory evidence that is supportive of it? Is there a dose-response relationship? The more does your risk of lung cancer increase with the more cigarettes you smoke, or for the longer duration that you smoke? So for our study, you start off with a golf course. So it turns out like people who live near the golf course are at increased risk, but the people who work with the pesticides, 3 studies have linked it. So you have a sense like for farmers are at the most risk. People who drink well water are at intermediate risk, and people who don't do either have the lowest risk. So when you start looking at the information in toto, you come up to this conclusion. The other thing is you might want to ask yourself, what evidence would you want? So I'll give you one final one. One of my colleagues, Dr. Tim Greenemeyer, who was, I think, on your panel.
Yeah, he was, yeah.
So Dr. Tim Greenemeyer, an outstanding Parkinson specialist and an outstanding neuroscientist and probably a better person. Very humble. In 2000, he and his colleagues showed that chronic exposure to a naturally occurring pesticide called rotenone produced Parkinson's disease in laboratory rats. And so he said chronic exposure to a pesticide, rotenone, causes Parkinson's disease in laboratory rats. Like the other pesticides that are linked to Parkinson's, it damages the mitochondria, the energy-producing parts of cell. 20 years later, he discloses that he himself developed Parkinson's disease.
Wow. And
in an article in Science, he says he perhaps was not as careful as he should have been in terms of the experiments that he was conducting in terms of minimizing his own exposure. So we've done the human experiments. I really don't know what more evidence people want or what could be generated to answer the questions. We're not going to randomize people to farm with paraquat and not farm with paraquat and follow them for 50 years. If we did, I strongly suspect we would see high rates of Parkinson's disease.
Wow. Yeah, that's what's referred to as the Bradford-Hill criteria, which interestingly came up just an episode ago with Dr. Leo Trasande, one of your colleagues.
Oh yeah, he's outstanding. I just met with him a couple of days ago. So he's a pediatrician, and he's been doing this for longer than I've been, and he's been looking at the effects of endocrine disrupting compounds on the development of children. And so we were just talking last week, so I'm now in New York City, could we look at the exposure to these chemicals as a child, and then what does this mean for them 30, 40, 50 years later? So for your listeners, Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies should be a concern for, as a parent, for your children. And I should disclose, my wife said when we had young children, we should buy organic, and I would poo-poo the idea because I didn't know, and I was ignorant. But I think we should be thinking about this for exposures for children in terms of what they eat and what's in their school. It turns out that, not here in California, I'll come back to that, in most schools and playgrounds around the United States, we spray pesticides, including nerve toxins. I mean, we're spraying pesticides on kids' playgrounds in schools. We're exposing them to knowingly exposing them to nerve toxins. I mean, there's some things that we're just doing that just don't make any sense.
It's very upsetting.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.